Okay, this video is looking at the environmental considerations. So this dot point falls under what role do preventative actions play in enhancing the well-being of the athlete. Our syllabus asks us to learn about temperature regulation. So we're going to have a look at convection, radiation, conduction and evaporation in this video. You also have to think about climatic conditions. So that's temperature, humidity, wind, rain, altitude and pollution. Then we're going to talk about some of the guidelines for fluid intake and how acclimatization works and what it's useful for. You'll learn to ask you to evaluate strategies an athlete can employ to support the body's temperature regulation mechanisms. So what can it do to help make sure that convection, radiation, conduction and evaporation are working to effectively maintain the body's temperature. And then also you need to analyse the impact of climatic conditions on safe sports participation. So that is, how does temperature affect safe participation? And particularly there's a teacher's note for this part of the syllabus that says that you need to really understand how the combination of heat and humidity make it more likely for you to get hypothermia, and how the combination of wind and cold make it more likely that you will get hypothermia. The first temperature regulation mechanism is convection. Now, convection is the movement of air or water or any other kind of fluid across the surface of your skin, and it takes heat away with it, or it can give heat to your skin in the process. There are a number of strategies that you can use to support convection. So that might be using a fan if it's really hot. It might mean pouring water over your body and the water running across your skin surface. That's convection as it takes it away. If it's cold, you want to stop convection, and so you're going to maybe wear a windbreaker that's going to stop the wind from coming past the surface of your body to take heat away. The next one is radiation, which is when heat is transferred essentially through kind of waves, so the radio waves, how it travels. So radiation is experienced when you experience heat from the sun, from light, from fire, and all that kind of stuff as well. They're all forms of radiation heat. Strategies that you can use to help support radiation, particularly if it's hot. So if it's hot, you want to make sure that you expose the skin, because your skin will send out heat through radiation. This is probably one of the least effective ways that your body has, though, to lose heat, and so it's not a great temperature regulation mechanism, but it is an extra one. So you want to expose your skin to the environment to help that radiated heat escape. You might also want to go and play in the shade or something to avoid the radiation that you're going to experience from the sun. If it's cold, however, you want to get in that sun, expose your skin to that sun and soak in some of that radiation. You don't have to necessarily expose your skin to get the radiation. You can get the warmth through some clothing, particularly like black clothing will help absorb the heat that's done by the light and therefore make your body warmer as a result. The next temperature regulation mechanism is conduction. Conduction is when heat is transferred between two objects when they're in contact with each other. So strategies that you can use to help your body regulate its temperature when it's hot would be to wear an ice vest. So an ice vest will help to conduct heat away from the body into the ice and melt the ice. Other ways are for you to essentially put your body in contact with another cooler surface. So it might be going and lying down the concrete in the shade. Again, you're going to just lose some heat through conduction. And then the opposite if it's cold. If it's cold, you can use a heat pack to conduct some heat into your body, and you might want to go and find a nice rock that's been in the sun, lie on that rock and have some conduction come into your body, some heat transfer through conduction from the rock. The last one, and definitely the one that is most important for human beings, we definitely use evaporation as our main temperature regulation mechanism. So evaporation is the loss of heat as a result of the water that's on your skin turning into a vapor. So essentially it's kind of like your body is conducting heat into the water to heat it up, and then when that water turns into a vapor, it takes a whole bunch of that heat away. And so evaporation is essentially the way that your body works when you are sweating. Okay, so when you sweat, your body is doing that so that you have small amounts of water on your skin, which will then evaporate into the atmosphere. Strategies that you can use to support evaporation would be to make sure you're drinking lots and lots of water. You could pour water on your skin as well. So you would lose heat originally through convection as the water ran over your skin. But once it had stopped running off your skin and it was sitting on your skin, your body would heat up that water and it would evaporate, taking heat away from your body. In terms of when it's cold, evaporation is going to be a bad thing when it's cold. So often people will try and remove any kind of wet clothing when it's cold to help make sure that they're not losing heat through that water evaporating off of the skin. They might dry their skin with a towel. So if they're sweating when it's cold, they might dry that sweat off with the towel. You could also add a barrier, such as a nice windbreaker or a jacket or something that doesn't breathe overly well, because what that barrier will do is essentially cause the humidity between that barrier and your skin to increase. And we'll talk about this a bit more in a moment, but humidity essentially, if the more humidity there is in the atmosphere, the less water will evaporate off of your skin and turn into vapor. And that means that you're going to lose less heat through evaporation when it's a humid environment. And so if you can manage to wear some kind of barrier that allows the environment within those clothes to become humid, you'll then lose less heat through evaporation as well. We come to climatic conditions now, and there's a range of climatic conditions that you need to understand, and you also need to understand how some of these combine to make it more dangerous for the athlete. The first climatic condition we're going to look at is heat. Heat is essentially going to look at hot environments. So when it's hot outside, how are we going to manage our heat? Because we need to lose heat rather than gain heat. But when it's a hot environment, essentially you are gaining heat from everything. So we're going to gain heat through radiation. So that can be from the sun. It can also be heat that's radiating off the ground. It can be heat that's radiating off of glass or windows or mirrors or anything like that as well. It can be heat that's radiating off the water, because the heat from the sun will reflect off the water's surface as well, and that then adds more heat to the body. We're going to have heat added to our body through convection as well, because the wind is going to be nice and warm. The environment is generally warm, and so that's going to add heat to our body as it goes past. And then also through conduction, so anything that we're touching, whether we're running on the road, whether we're riding a bike, whatever it is that we're touching, if the surface is going to be hotter than our body, then we're going to essentially have heat transfer to the body and heat the body up. When it's hot, our bodies must lose heat through evaporation and other strategies. So essentially, evaporation, we're going to sweat a lot when it's hot, and we're looking for all of that water to evaporate and go into the atmosphere as vapor. We may also use some other strategies to go along with that. So we might squirt some cold water around our skin, and then we can lose some heat through convection as well. We might want to make sure that we're also using light breathable clothing. That means that the wind can get in there when it's hot, as we're running, and we can lose some heat through convection, hopefully. We're also going to make sure that we drink lots of fluids so that we're supporting that evaporation that's happening in our body, because as we sweat and sweat and sweat, we then get dehydrated. So we need to drink plenty of fluids in order to maintain our ability to sweat and lose heat through that mechanism. Now, the biggest risk when it's hot is hypothermia. So hypothermia is a risk when the temperature is hot or when the temperature is warm, and it's going to become even more of a risk if we add heat to humidity. When we look at humidity, humidity is when we have lots of water concentrated in the air. So high humidity means we have lots of water in the air. If we have a low humidity, it means we have little or no water in the air. And so essentially, the more humid it is, so the higher the percentage of water vapor in the air, the less efficient our evaporation is going to be at losing heat. Okay, it's because water will not transfer from a liquid into a vapor if there's already high concentrations of water in the air. There's only a certain amount of water that can go into the air, and if otherwise it's going to require more heat to get it up there. But generally speaking, it's not going to. And if you're really into chemistry and stuff, then you'll understand how that's at equilibrium and how that needs to be balanced nicely. So the higher the concentration, the higher the humidity, means that your evaporation, your sweat, is not working efficiently in terms of losing heat. And so you've got to rely on other things in humid environments. But if we combine heat and humidity, and that means that we have a really high risk of hypothermia, because not only are we gaining heat through convection, through conduction, and through radiation, we also are not going to be losing as much heat as we should be through evaporation because of the high humidity levels. And that means we really have to work on using strategies to help support the athlete to maintain their body temperature. So things like an ice vest, pouring water all over the body, drinking lots of fluids, and avoiding being out in the heat of the day are strategies that the athlete can use to help maintain their body temperature and allow them to lose heat through those mechanisms, even though the environment is not conducive to that. We then come to cold conditions. So cold conditions means that our body is going to be losing heat all the time. So we're going to lose heat through radiation, we're going to lose heat through conduction, we're going to lose heat through evaporation, and we're going to lose heat through convection. So essentially, our body is going to radiate heat into the environment really easily. We are going to lose heat whenever we touch something that's colder than us. We are going to lose heat through evaporation of our sweat, and we're going to lose heat through convection as the cold wind or even just the cold air goes across our skin. So here we have to add heat through energy production. So whenever we break ATP into ADP and phosphate, we have the production of heat, which is great when it's cold because it means that your body will automatically start to shiver, for example, and your shivering is about breaking ATP in order to produce some heat to heat up your body. And so when we're coming to some strategies that might be used in the cold, you might do an extra long warm-up because that warm-up is really essentially just producing more heat within the body. You've got to make sure that body is nice and warm before you go into competition or before you go into training. And so a good proper warm-up, making sure that you're producing lots of heat through your warm-up, then make sure that your body temperature rises up and that it's ready for performance. Other strategies that you can use are making sure you're wearing appropriate clothing. If you go to the snow and you're snowboarding or something, you should be wearing snow gear, snow pants, snow jackets, boots, beanies, gloves, etc. You don't want to be in that environment in shorts and a t-shirt, although I have seen that in Australia. You want to also avoid getting wet because if you get wet, that water is cold. You're going to lose heat faster through conduction and faster through convection as that water pours off you or as it sucks heat out of you. If you then need to evaporate that, you're going to lose even more heat. If we then add wind to that, it becomes even more of a problem. So we're going to try and avoid getting wet. We're going to try and avoid being in the wind because we have a risk when it's cold of the athlete becoming hypothermic, which means their body temperature is getting too low. Now, when we combine cold conditions with wind, it becomes even more dangerous in terms of getting hypothermia. So wind essentially means we're going to lose heat through convection. And the faster the wind, the faster you lose that heat. The colder the wind, the faster you lose that heat. So if we have cold, windy conditions, we're losing a lot of heat through convection and becomes very dangerous as we start to think about hypothermia occurring. So strategies that athletes are going to use to avoid hypothermia during these cold, windy conditions, they're going to make sure that they dry their sweat off with a towel to make sure that they're not losing heat through convection and to make sure that that sweat doesn't become really cold. We're going to make sure that we're drinking possibly warm water. So normally an athlete would drink cold water as they're doing sports. But if it's cold and windy, you might want to make sure that that water, you don't want it to be hot. You're not going to go and drink like a hot cup of tea or something. You just want it to be nice and warm, around body temperature, 36 to 38 kind of degrees, so that when we drink that warm water, it heats up our body. We're also going to make sure that we're wearing appropriate clothing. So because it's windy, you want to make sure that whatever you're wearing is essentially acts as a windbreaker and stops the wind from coming in contact with your skin, and that then allows you to maintain your body temperature more efficiently. Next we come to rain. So when it's raining, everything gets wet. So we're going to have lots and lots of loss of heat through contact with the water. Generally speaking, rain is not going to be warmer than your body is, so you're always going to lose water. So you're always going to lose heat when it rains. So water is going to remove heat by convection as it runs and moves along your body. It's also going to lose some heat through conduction and evaporation as it sits on your body and then evaporates off. If rain is added to cold conditions, it becomes really bad because cold, wet conditions, particularly if it's like windy and rainy as well, hypothermia becomes really, really, really more likely when those conditions exist. So if we have rainy conditions where the athlete is getting wet and therefore We have heat loss through convection and conduction and stuff, and evaporation of that water. We then also are going to have heat loss through all the other mechanisms because it's cold, and if it's windy, the convection goes up even more. It becomes dangerous in terms of the person regulating their body temperature. The other way that rain can become dangerous is that it actually causes slippery surfaces. Surprise. So netball games that are outside often are cancelled when it's raining because it's dangerous. If you go and run around and try and be really agile on a netball court when it's wet and slippery, you're going to fall over. So rain can make it dangerous because it becomes slippery, muddy, people fall over. Our next climatic condition is altitude. Now, altitude is really important for your performance because essentially, if you're performing at really high altitudes, it means you have lower oxygen concentrations because as you go up in altitude, the concentration of oxygen decreases. As you go down in altitude, the concentration of oxygen increases. When you think of this a bit like a pool, so if you go into a pool, as you dive down towards the bottom of the pool, you start to feel the pressure from the water pushing against your body. Now, that pressure is the same in when you come up out of the water and you're actually on land. So when you're on land, all the air particles are also pushing and compressing against one another. It's just not as hard or not as easily felt as it is when you're in water. So what that means is that when you're at lower altitudes, all the air that's sitting on top of you is causing pressure down and pushing all that air together, making it a higher concentration of air particles, which means there's a higher concentration of oxygen. As you go up in altitude, however, you have less air molecules sitting on top of each other, and so they start to spread out because the pressure is not, they don't have the same amount of pressure pushing down on them, and so your oxygen concentration becomes less. Okay, now if you have low oxygen concentrations when you're at high altitude, it makes you at a high risk of suffering a thing called hypoxia. Now, hypoxia essentially means that your body is not getting enough oxygen for it to maintain its basic functions. Okay, and so people who start to feel symptoms that go along with hypoxia will feel things like dizziness, they'll get lethargic, they will be breathless, they will get a bit lightheaded and stuff. And this is essentially because the athlete is not getting enough oxygen to transfer around their body. And so the main strategy that is used is acclimatization, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but essentially acclimatization means that you go and you are in those conditions. So you might go up to high altitude if you're going to compete in high altitude. You'll go and you'll train there for a while, or you'll live there before competition in order to allow your body time to adjust to those conditions. So your body will produce more hemoglobin and allow for faster transport of oxygen because there's less oxygen in the air, and therefore it needs it in order to survive. And so you have a stress and your body will adapt to it. But if you go there and you haven't acclimatized, you haven't had a chance to adapt to the stress, and then you try and perform, you're going to have issues. You might get hypoxia, but also you're just going to perform worse. You're not going to be, particularly if it's an aerobic performance, it's going to be quite difficult for you to perform at the level that you're used to down at sea level. Other strategies are going to include altitude training. So altitude training we'll look at in a bit more detail, but altitude training, there's a wide variety of different ways of doing altitude training. So essentially the live high, train low method is the one that you'll want to make sure you know quite well. Lots of concerns come up with pollution. They include things like cancer. If what you're breathing in has asbestos in it, then asbestosis becomes an issue. But generally, the main things that are going to occur are more like lung infections, so producing a nice hefty chest cough, having runny noses, just kind of like a cold, but then you get more of an infection that goes along with it. People get sick for long periods of time, their performance decreases when they're sick, and it may take them a while to recover, and they'll have to move generally out of that pollution. The only real strategies that people can use in a polluted environment is either to not participate, avoid the environment completely, or wear a mask, and even wearing a mask isn't going to do a lot for you. We now come to the guidelines for fluid intake. So we're going to run through this relatively quickly because it's essentially just learning a few numbers and why it's important. So pre-performance or pre-training or pre-whatever kind of physical activity you're going to do, you're going to drink 500 milliliters of water or sports drink at least 4 hours before. So this is presuming that you're already nice and hydrated. from the night before or during the day. So now 4 hours before exercise, you're drinking 500 mils of water. Now you might do that across half an hour where you're drinking 250 mils here, and then another 15 to 20 minutes later you might drink another 250 mils, and then 10 to 15 minutes before performance you're going to drink another 300 mils. Now they're rough guides because, you know, if you're really small you're going to use a bit less water. If you're really big you're going to need a bit more water, but essentially that's just the guidelines that are provided by the Sports Medicine Australia. During competition you need to make sure that you're essentially maintaining a level of hydration. So the recommendations there are that you are drinking 150 mils of water every 15 to 20 minutes of exercise, provided that that is less than 60 minutes of exercise. Once you start going over the 60 minutes of exercise, then you're going to start to think about consuming. It's still 150 mils every 15 to 20 minutes, but now a sports drink becomes recommended to make sure that you're also replacing your electrolytes and gaining a little bit of glucose. So that just essentially helps you use your anaerobic system for longer. It helps you use your aerobic system for a bit longer too, but also make sure you're replacing the electrolytes that you lose during sweat, which helps to maintain your body's hydration, and that helps to increase your performance. You want to make sure that you do not consume more than 1 litre per hour as you're doing your exercise, and even after, you don't want to consume more than 1 litre an hour. You want to spread that consumption of liquid out. The fluid guidelines for after exercise. After exercise, you're essentially looking to replace all the fluid that you've lost within the next 2 hours after your exercise. So that means that you're going to weigh yourself before exercise, you're going to weigh yourself after exercise. The difference, so let's say you weighed 86 kilos before exercise and then you weighed 84 kilos, that's a 2 kilo difference. And that means that you've lost 2 litres of water through sweat during that exercise. So the guidelines say that you should drink 1.5 litres of fluid for every kilo that you've lost. That means that the person who has lost 2 kilos needs to drink 3 litres of water in the next 2 hours. Now that kind of goes against the drinking more than 1 litre per hour, but if the person spaces it out nicely, they can still consume it quite quickly within the 3 hours or something afterwards. The 2 hours is not mandatory, but it is recommended that you get as much liquid into you to replace it within the first 2 hours. Acclimatization is about your body getting used to the conditions in which you're going to perform. So basically you need to make sure that you're getting 60 minutes a day of exposure to the environment that you're going to be performing in for 7 to 10 days as a minimum. Okay, that will then cause a stress to your body that allows your body to adapt. Now that can be if you're going to play in really hot conditions, it can be if you're going to play in really cold conditions, or it can be if you're going to go and play at really high or really low altitudes. You want to go and make sure that your body has adapted to those conditions so that you're ready to perform in those conditions. Your 60 minutes a day for 7 to 10 days a week can be in a real environment. So you can go and stay at the high altitude or in the hot conditions where you're going to be performing for that 7 to 10 days, and your body will adapt. Or you can set up yourself what's down here in the bottom right hand corner, which is essentially an altitude tent. And an altitude tent, you can set all the conditions within that tent, and you just have to go and hang out in there for your 60 minutes a day for 7 to 10 days. Which is a way a lot of athletes tend to do it, because altitude tents actually aren't overly expensive. Generally they're cheaper than the flight that's going to take you to go to the place where you're going to be in competition. You can then control whether it's hot, whether it's humid, you can also control how much oxygen concentration there is. So that then makes it really easy for people to do the live high, train low altitude training method. So that means that they go and they train in normal conditions around sea level, which means that they can train at really high intensities because there's plenty of oxygen around for them to breathe in. But then they go and they spend at least an hour a day in the high altitude type conditions in the tent, which stimulates their body to produce more hemoglobin anyway, because while you're in those low concentrations of oxygen, your body needs to produce hemoglobin so that it can transport more of that oxygen around. So it's essentially kind of like a training regime where you're doing an hour a day where your body is not getting enough oxygen, and so that causes a stress for it to adapt and then produce more hemoglobin, which then benefits particularly your aerobic performances.